Hey team, how's it going? Hey, how's it going? Welcome to the second day of CypherCon. I made it through.
I'm short, you probably can see over my head.
Looking out into the audience, to see a lot of friendly faces. This is why I love speaking at CypherCon, because I can look at all my friends in the audience. But for those of you who I don't know, my name is Traxler. I'm the principal security researcher at a company called Vector AI, focusing on threats as they exist within AWS and GCP. Not Azure, don't talk to me about Azure. So I work in the R&D of the product, working to improve our capabilities of detecting attacker behaviors on the cloud control plane. Very cool stuff. I really enjoyed my job. It's working at the threat intersection between identity and the cloud. That's where I get to hang out all day long, and I love it. I was reflecting on my InfoSec career last night, and I came to the conclusion that my career might sound a little chaotic to some, thinking about some of the jobs that I've had. In-house pen testing. Done a fair amount of AppSec work, testing those in-house APIs and web apps, writing tickets and working with dev teams. I've done a lot of security architecture in the cloud for a Fortune 50 company. And I worked on a security architecture and engineering team, building the guardrails to support a company's acceleration to the cloud. And then finally last year, I made this switch over from the proactive, preventative controls side of the house to the detective side of the house, where partly because I become a little disillusioned with preventative controls in the cloud. I saw that those preventative controls only took you so far. They were bound to fail. So if you look at my talks online, you can see a lot of talks on this limiting of the IAM blast radius. I've done a ton of talks on permissions and privilege escalation, but now I'm really focusing on day 2 in the cloud. What happens when, despite your best efforts, everything has failed, and you really must detect what's happening. So in my research, I did focus on a set of permissions that would allow an attacker to acquire the ability to perform certain behaviors. I just went right for what the business impact might be and then what recovery steps might happen. I should say, don't be concerned if you didn't catch anything the first time in this talk. The slides for this presentation will certainly be made available, but I also published a white paper a few days ago where all of this content is in this white paper, all this content and more that you could ever want is in this white paper. So you can find all of that on my Twitter, Nightmare.js. Please feel free to take a look at that, and I'll publish a link to that right after this talk. So here's a perfectly reasonable question that I think is healthy for all of us to ask. Why would ransomware target the cloud? Will it even affect my cloud deployments? And I think it's reasonable to ask the questions, and I want to tell you how I've been thinking about it. I look at ransomware clearly as a financially motivated crime with the goal to inhibit business systems in order to extract a ransom payment. So historically, there's been plenty of money to be made in ransoming data on traditional on-prem systems. So for me, the question is more about, will there be evolutionary pressure on attackers to force them to evolve their tactics? I'm not sure if there's a reason that malware authors would need to redesign their malware if the old ways of doing things are still perfectly profitable. But as I observe the volume and speed with which enterprises are undergoing cloud migrations, I mean, they're full on ditching the data center. I don't see how ransomware could not become a larger problem for businesses with cloud-hosted data. So my thesis on the subject is that wherever the business critical data goes, ransomware will go. So when there's the moment that there's the critical mass of business data in the cloud, this is when it makes financial sense for the attackers to evolve their tactics to target the on-prem cloud, to target the cloud versus on-prem systems. We can't think that attackers are going to just leave money on the table. Just because that, your organization's in the middle of a massive cloud migration and the attacker's old, Word doc exploit isn't going to work in the cloud anymore. They're not going to just walk away from the money. So this is kind of where my research came into play. When I asked the question, how should we think about the characteristics of an attack in the cloud, and then how can we compare and contrast it to an on-prem event? Attackers in the cloud plane, they don't have any Windows processes to manipulate. They don't have any, typically have any hosts to exploit. They don't have any unpatched Exchange servers. So what does this mean for an attacker to gain control of a cloud-native application? In the cloud, the available tools that developers and customers need to accomplish their everyday tasks, these are built-in services. They're offered as features by the cloud service providers. With access to these same tools and capabilities, they're often used by bad actors to overcome security controls, avoid detection, and accomplish specific goals. Using features with ill intent is often referred to as feature abuse, where feature abuse is rather the misuse of cloud-native tools. And the APIs created by the hardworking developers at AWS, at GCP, this strikes me as not entirely dissimilar to an on-prem attack where malware is using the utilities that it finds right on its infected systems to advance and spread. So living off the land techniques. The LOL binaries in the cloud, they're not your sticky keys. They're the cloud APIs themselves, feature-rich, public, open. In contrast to the Windows executables, which can be uninstalled as superfluous. AWS cloud APIs, they're always on. They're open, they're cloud native, and it makes them very attractive for abusers to misuse. Not with your old crusty data warehouses though, those tried and true data warehouses that many organizations are rapidly running away from. These on-prem servers are typically full stack environments, physical hosts. However, these full stack environments, while they have a broad attack surface, they're generally secured by 20 years of understanding on how to secure these environments. They're cordoned off into the deep recesses of a corporate network. They're heavily monitored by agent-based tools. There's a corpus of understanding on how to handle these legacy systems. While there are a large attack surface, there's also a large understanding on how we handle threats facing the on-prem systems. But this on-prem approach to securing traditional data centers, your a host-based agents, your network-based controls, it doesn't necessarily translate to the cloud. And I'm saying it probably shouldn't actually translate to the cloud. We shouldn't try to shoehorn it in. Data that's migrated to the cloud resides in systems where the end users, including malicious actors, are going to have limited curated access to the underlying systems. Generally, everybody just lives at layer 7, and this is a curated experience from the CSP. This means that cloud data stores have these dramatically different attack surfaces. Each of the major cloud providers has a ubiquitous cloud data store, S3, Azure Blob, GCP buckets, but today on my research, I really focused on the AWS S3 buckets. But the attacks that I'm going to be describing are not unique to AWS. Rather, they're going to be pretty applicable to any cloud where you have a system, a data store, that can be encrypted, and those encryption keys can be restricted by some sort of conditional access. That's the recipe that we're going to be following. All right, this is the point of my talk where people's eyes might glaze over. I appreciate we have to do a little cryptography today. A little bit, just a little bit. And in an effort to like compare and contrast on-prem malware with cloud ransomware, I thought, like, what are the steps, what are the hoops that on-prem ransomware has to go through necessarily to perform their actions, right? So ransomware targeting on-prem systems, they're going to have to use this hybrid approach, this hybrid encryption scheme, leveraging both worlds, leveraging both symmetric and asymmetric encryptions to work around the limitations of both asymmetric and symmetric encryption. So where asymmetric encryption is really slow, symmetric encryption is really fast. Yes, we want that as a malware author. Symmetric encryption uses both the same key, though, for encryption and decryption. So if you have just a purely symmetric encryption strategy for encrypting your targeted data, right, it might make it easier by forensics teams to recover that key if they're doing some post-incident forensics. So the strategy that ransomware authors use to kind of work around this limitation, these are the same techniques that your in-house cryptographic operators, your crypto guys are going to use day in, day out. So whether for benevolent or malevolent intent, key hierarchies are used to derive one set of keys from another to encrypt the symmetric keys. It's not necessary this is necessary for the on-prem encryptors and completely not necessary for the cloud. If an attacker leverages your CSP's key management service, because cloud providers have done the heavy lifting for you. They're maintaining secure roots of trust. And there's really no reason for attackers not to piggyback on the cryptographic niceties that are provided by a CSP. All right, so we're going to talk a lot about KMS, AWS KMS. It's a service that allows AWS customers to generate keys, control access to these keys, use and perform cryptographic operations, signing, verifying, managing envelope encryption, and interestingly enough, it's also the process for managing the keys that are used for server-side encryption in S3. So what I'm going to showcase to you is just a really quick demo of two buckets. You'll see an attacker who has gained significant permissions in an AWS account. They're going to copy objects from one bucket, which I'll call the victim bucket. This is the bucket that they're targeting for encryption. They're going to copy those objects to a staging bucket. The objects in the second bucket are encrypted with a KMS key. That KMS key is under the attacker's control, not available for use in the victim's account. So when he copies the objects over to the second staging bucket, S3 and KMS are going to server-side encrypt those objects with the KMS key that's controlled by the attacker. And I just wanted to show you briefly what this looks like, what the user experience looks like, specifically when a customer no longer has access to the underlying backing key when objects are server-side encrypted with KMS. We're just looking at the bucket that, let's see here. Yeah, what I'm showcasing here is that an attacker has copied over objects to the staging bucket, again with a key that only they control. Our victim does not control. I'm going to switch users over here to our victim account. Somebody who doesn't have access to the underlying backing key, and I just want to highlight to you the effect on availability. Okay, they're going over to the staging bucket. And try to download an object. Yeah. Oh. There we go. Access denied. It's hard to see there. Let me see if I can zoom in. Nope, can't zoom in. Anyways, access denied. So our victim account very well may have access to the objects, very well may have access to the buckets, but that backing key they don't have access to. And AWS dutifully is not going to give them access to those objects. Okay, so what happened here? Why were the keys unavailable? One of the mechanisms for controlling access to these keys is by defining a resource-based policy on the key. And as such, defining a policy on the key, defining who is allowed and who is denied access, that leaves our attacker the opportunity to affect availability on the key and affect availability on the objects. My research here, and as I'll go more into it, it's really focusing on a key policy lockout technique that was very first described in 2020 by a gentleman called Spencer Geetson from Rhino Security. So I highly recommend you take a look at his talk from coming up on 2 years ago, where he goes into this specific key policy lockout technique on S3, and also some other mechanisms for affecting availability on DynamoDB. So to recap, the KMS key in the target account would somehow need to become under the control of an attacker, either by the creation of a new key, as I described, or maybe an attacker has gained the ability to update the resource policy and can affect availability on an existing key, potentially. Both of these mechanisms, whether the key is new, whether the key is existing, they have the same lockout effect. The victim is locked out of their data. So we can expect these access denied responses from AWS, where requests originate from callers that lack explicit permissions to access both S3 objects and the KMS keys. So if an end user has an explicit deny permission on the object or the key, S3 is not going to serve the data. The behavior that we saw in the little demo there is something that I call deny except when, allow only when. Break this out to two different statements on the key policy. Deny all actions on the KMS key, except when the source IP address is mine, the attacker-controlled IP. Oh, and also, by the way, allow all actions on the KMS key only when the source IP is from my attacker-controlled IP. So when updating the resource-based key policy attached to the KMS key, this is a pattern that you could potentially see in an attacker attempting to affect the availability of any resource. And it would affect even the root user. Even the root user would be unable to access the KMS key and thus the data. So in this resource-based policy, this is actually the one that I used for my demo. I'm showcasing the use of the IP address condition to restrict access to the KMS resource. But you can imagine there's some other conditions that might be leveraged by a ransomware operator looking to employ this pattern. Some other conditions they might use, maybe the AWS principal arm, saying you can't access this KMS key unless you're coming from this specific AWS principal arm, and oh, by the way, that's attacker controlled. Principal account condition, source VPC restriction, or source VPC endpoint restriction. The lesson here is that any condition in a policy where the value is required by the caller, it's unique, and it's attacker controlled, that's when it can be leveraged to lock out a customer from the resource. So just like we can't presume to know what ransomware would look like in the cloud, what it would look like to impact resources, we can't presume to know what the relinquishing of data would look like, what passing over that decryption key would look like in the cloud. So in the cloud, turning over the keys to encrypted data would look just as different as techniques used for impact. So in the scenario that I laid out, that I demoed, only callers from the attacker-controlled account can access the KMS key, right? That locks up availability. But to update that key policy again, to relinquish control, it cannot be performed cross-account. So you're locked, you're stuck. Malware authors are going to need a real-time, a viable mechanism for returning control to the victim, and it can't involve updating that key policy again. It can't involve the attacker updating this policy cross-account, because that's just not allowed in AWS. They gotta think of another way. Fortunately, I did for them. Okay. KMS key grants. So how might an attacker, complete the life cycle and return data to the victim? KMS key grants is a possibility. So it's an alternative access control mechanism for KMS keys used to delegate cryptographic operations. Just because I'm denied access to the key and key policy doesn't mean that somebody can generate a key grant token to say, oh, actually, by the way, you can use the key to encrypt or decrypt or sign or verify or whatever. A KMS key grant would allow the victim to access their KMS key and begin the decryption process without having to update that key policy cross-account, which is disallowed in AWS. I'm not psychic, but I feel like a few people in here have been wondering, like, where is AWS in all of this? Like, where could they have helped me? I think that's very valid. I think we should start talking about all of this out loud, if for nothing else but to force their hand in saying what they could or could not help us with. Where's the shared responsibility? Where's the shared responsibility model? How does it factor in? We don't really know. There's 3 potential scenarios that stand out for me that I think are worth talking out loud about. The first scenario is for an AWS intervention, hypothesizes that what if AWS could just go into their data center, go into their HSM, and break out that key material you need and give it to you. This feels like an absolutely ridiculous thought. You know, AWS KMS is a very serious service created by very serious people. And the thought that that would be even technically feasible, you know, I feel a little guilty even hypothesizing out loud, but I think it's worth saying in case I was in anybody's thoughts. AWS has gone to great lengths to ensure that no person, no system could retrieve that key material, and they make earnest public statements to that effect. So I think the first possibility is out of the question, cross that off. The next scenarios for an AWS intervention are like much more of an open question to me. The first avenue for assistance would involve AWS having the ability to change the victim's environment. There's no evidence that AWS can reverse a maliciously applied key policy. So restoring access to a KMS key, there's no indication that they can do that. There's no indication that they have this hand of God that they can reach in and update a key policy. And there's honestly not much incentive to publicly admit that they could if they did. The final bit of assisted remediation that we kind of ponder is the idea that, you know, would AWS have the ability to commandeer an account which the malicious actors are operating out of? Like the trust and safety team at AWS, they will quarantine accounts, they will close rogue accounts if they're violating terms of service. But quarantining closed accounts is much different than seizing control of an account, and you would fully need to seize control over that account and the resources, and you need to take over that account. And there's actually some evidence to suggest that they can do that, that ability technically exists. So if anybody's familiar with the mechanism to change the root email address for your account, change the root email address if you've forgotten the password and MFA, if anybody's ever been lucky enough to be in that position. Yeah, AWS, I own this account. Do you have the root email? No. Do you have the root password? No. Do you have the root MFA? Sorry. There is actually a process for recovering your account if all hope seems to be lost. You have to submit an affidavit, notarized affidavit to AWS. In my experience, it takes a couple months. They process it and they verify that you own it, and then they will change the root email address to something that you have control over. So this internal process suggests that AWS does have the power to seize control over accounts. Not just simply close them, but restore, to access the resources housed with them with some sort of, you know, admin capabilities. But similar to the hand of God theory, I just don't see that they have a lot of incentive to publicly admit this. From a defender's point of view, from a GRC point of view, from a legal point of view, from an everybody in the world point of view, without a clear documented process for assisted recovery from AWS, without guaranteed SLAs on a process, like any theoretical remediation assistance from AWS is just not useful. So planning for response, planning for recovery from a ransomware event, it should not be centered on the idea that AWS can help you. Thumbs up. We got some thumbs up. We're here, we're there. Yes, AWS cannot help you. Cool. Okay, so rooted in the understanding that it's unlikely AWS could help during a ransomware event, we turn our sights to the bread and butter of all security programs, preventative controls, and detection and response capabilities. I'll start by underscoring that these controls I'm going to go through, they are unlikely to be compatible with highly transactional data. But they could be feasible if you're looking to secure your backups, secure your, offsites, if your offsite backups are in the cloud. These are some controls that you might want to look at. But knowing where your data is and knowing which data you need to secure is the first step for enforcing any of these bucket level controls. So it goes back down to asset management. Okay, S3 bucket configurations. As I said, not all S3 buckets can be configured to be a fortress. But it's worth noting the controls available in S3 which can add to the overall ransom resiliency strategy. It's kind of a trifecta here of controls. S3 object lock does exactly what you would imagine. You can't delete an object. Object versioning, instead of every time a new version of an object is updated, you don't replace the old object, you just create a million versions of it. So it can prevent some malicious encryption, rewriting your existing data. And then the final one I'll touch on is MFA delete. So MFA delete is a setting that says, okay, if you really have to delete this data, you have to be using the root user, and that root user has to be using MFA. So a pretty high bar to cross in order to delete some data. Kind of an architect at heart, so I kind of went overboard in talking about the defensive architectural patterns here. Mitigations via SCP, service control policy. These are going to require a certain level of maturity in your cloud security program. So it doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive for these goals, but I fully don't expect that everybody's going to get there on day one. So a couple things. We can potentially create a bespoke SCP policy that says these are the only keys that are allowed to perform cryptographic operations on your keys. Naming these specific keys and being able to know which specific keys those are, that's a good start in preventing cloud-native ransomware. Oftentimes, this type of SCP is coupled with an architectural pattern that will corral all of your KMS keys into a single account. This sort of creates this Fort Knox approach to key management. It creates this all of your eggs in one basket approach. But it also says all of your controls in one basket, all of your eyes in one basket. So a centralized key management account allows your security organization to enforce the principle of least privilege in just the most extreme sense in a very concentrated place. It says that here's the location where all of my keys live. Yes, it's a massive target, but yes, we're going to monitor the heck out of it and do least privilege like we've never done before right here. And it also allows for things like, bespoke SCP to say only keys out of this account can perform cryptographic operations. It's kind of a neat pattern. Some people hate it. It's fine. All right. I'd be remiss if I didn't leave with some signals you could latch onto in your environment to try to track down some of this behavior. The scenario I laid out had a threat actor using a key policy lockout method on a new KMS key. But also recognized is the possibility of using that same modus operandi on an existing key, or even maliciously encrypting S3 data with an external key. I didn't touch on that, but that's absolutely a possibility. So let's take a look at each 3 of these scenarios and talk about what you could find in CloudTrail that might tip you off to some unusual behavior and might warrant investigation. Okay. A key policy lockout with a new key. So if a threat actor employs this technique, there's a couple critical pivot points that you could be alerted on and respond to during this exploitation phase when you're looking at a new key. So first off, if your organization has a clear view into the approved keys, and all of a sudden a key that's not approved or not known or out of a weird account, alarm. Additionally, the updating of the key policy to include one of these, deny, except when, allow, only when conditional patterns, that's another potential point for alerting. Key policy lockout mechanism with an existing key is a little bit more tricky because potentially there's a scenario where you've done everything right with your defensive architectural patterns, you have this list of approved keys, and an attacker gains access to update the policy with one of those approved keys. At that point, what you're really going to try to latch onto is the updating of that key policy to a condition which would lock out the organization of their access in that conditional way. And then finally, in another scenario where you potentially encrypt data with an external key, security operations teams would want to be notified when these keys are being used that are external. This really relies on you having a fundamental idea on what is external to your organization. How do you know what's external and how do you know what's weird? If an external AWS account pops up, especially in the construct of a KMS key, that requires some follow-up. In conclusion, everything's on fire. Sort of. Cloud service providers make available services and APIs which can be misused and used and potentially leveraged by ransomware gangs. As successful ransomware campaigns in the cloud use cloud-native services to encrypt data, that can affect availability. You can affect availability with just built-in access control mechanisms. No fancy key hierarchies required. Drafting these central Fort Knox-like approaches to key management, I think, is a good step to preventing malware. So it's additionally the organization's responsibility, even in those most highly restricted environments, to plan for the day when your least privileged guardrails fail. As such, detecting if your cloud-hosted data is impacted by ransomware should be a priority. These detection techniques can depend subtly, depending on what variant of, cloud-native ransomware you're looking at, whether or not they're using an existing key, a new key, an external key. But it's all rooted under the understanding of you need to know what's external to your account, and you need to know what conditional policies would prevent you from accessing a resource at any given time. If you need more on cloud native ransomware, there's not a lot out there, but what there is out there is really, really choice. It's really foundational. Scott Piper put together just this comprehensive list on S3 mitigations. Most of my bits on bucket configurations were from his blog about a year ago, so I highly recommend checking out Scott Piper's blog. And then I also gave Spencer a shout out. Spencer's talk at the Cloud Village in 2020. He talks a lot about both this key policy lockout mechanism, also encrypting S3 data with client-side mechanisms, also affecting Dynamite DB. And I got a few minutes, so I'm gonna just dramatically change the subject here. Does anybody know what this is? CypherCon 2 speaker badge. Okay, I got a couple minutes here. Just want to let everybody know the speaker badge is up for auction. For a good cause, all benefits go to the McGizzy Foundation, a charity in Minneapolis that benefits youth in Minneapolis. You can go to that URL and put in your auction. Auction ends at the end of CypherCon. So I think bidding's up to $250 last I checked. So this is a steal. This fantastic cube right here. I have a couple minutes for questions. Questions, comments, concerns. Everybody's concerned about S3 ransomware. And we'll definitely take that. No? Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it.